of looters. They are robbing foreign citizens inter alia. Since the start of the hostilities in Sudan on the 15th of April, diplomatic missions and employees of Spain, France, Switzerland, India, Morocco, Egypt, and other countries were attacked. I just want to tell you all this for you to get a clear picture of the situation of this operation. Thanks to the highly professional and concerted efforts of representatives of all Russian agencies that were engaged in the evacuation, as well as careful preparation, including coordination with Sudanese authorities and forces on the ground at the route of the embassy convoy, we were able to evacuate a great number of Russians and foreigners. And when I'm saying that all Russians were evacuated, I'm not saying that all Russians were evacuated. I'm talking about only those who wanted to go back to Russia. Let me highlight the fact that Russian operations were depoliticized. They were humanitarian. And this is a sharp contrast to the discrimination approaches to a number of Western countries. By for example, we hear a lot about humanistic aspirations and the desire to fight for human rights, although it is not clear what kind of human we're talking about, because when we're talking about specific cases, we see double standards. So here our freedom fighters, primarily Washington, it evacuated immediately only the staff of its embassy and their family members. As for the evacuation of individuals, and by the way, Sudanese that have dual citizenship or residence permit in the US, they delayed that. There were also telling actions by the representatives of Ukraine. They refused to bring on board the only Russian citizen, employee of the Georgian company My Way, during the evacuation of Ukrainians, Georgians, and a number of other citizens, with the participation of Ukrainian air company SkyApp. But our embassy in Khartoum not only allowed evacuation of Ukrainians, but during the 2 weeks after the hostilities started, we have supported them and provided every assistance. If there are any doubt that such Kiev regime actions are judged by the military operation, do not have any illusions, because we saw the same thing 3 years ago, 2 years before the special military operation began, when there was evacuation of Ukrainians inter alia during the evacuation operation, when the world faced lockdowns due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Borders were closed, countries and many cities were isolated, and the Russian side back in the day organized these evacuation flights without any segregation and discrimination, allowing everyone to get on board. Of course, we prioritized Russian citizens because we are bound to provide our services and assistance to our citizens, to our compatriots. But if there were any seats left, should there be any opportunity, we provided for evacuation of Ukrainians, just like citizens of many other states. And we told you about that repeatedly. The Kiev regime back in the day even banned their diplomats to help evacuate Ukrainian citizens via Russian flights in 2020. So it's not about the special military operation, it's not about the conflict, it's about the attitude towards something the Kiev regime aspires to do, namely human rights, freedoms, and humanity approaches. The touch of humanism that is nowhere to be seen. And certainly I would like to draw your attention to the following. The Russian embassy in Sudan continues its functioning. Indeed, a number of employees were evacuated, but the mission is still continuing its work. Moving on to the situation in Ukraine, just in broad strokes. As you know, on May 1st, this world celebrated the Day of Spring and Labor, the International Day of Solidarity of Workers and Trade Unions. Up until recently, it was celebrated in Ukraine as well. However, in February this year, as part of its politics, well, funny as it seems, but still, as part of its decommunization policy, the holiday was abolished. I beg your pardon, but I would like to quote, "It was abolished as a Soviet remnant. The Kiev regime clearly doesn't know that this holiday emerged way before the Soviet Union." That brings us back to history and how it is treated under the Kiev regime auspices. So this International Day for Solidarity of Workers and Trade Unions was established in July 1889. Who established this holiday? Probably Zelensky doesn't know. Nobody told him. Maybe they tried to tell him, but he was out of his mind. But let me recall that it was established by the Paris Congress of the First International in honor of workers' rallies in Chicago on May 1st, 1886. And up until now, it is celebrated in many countries of the world. And maybe this might come as a shock to the Kiev regime. It is celebrated in the EU states that Ukraine dreams of being part of. By the way, the Labor Day is celebrated in the US and Canada as well, but it's not May 1st, but the first Monday of September. However, for the Kiev regime, it is of no importance because they rewrite a history by their own whims. As they desire to rewrite the history, the Kiev regime is ready to do anything. It needs to recode the mindset of millions of Ukrainians and those who associate themselves with this country to impose the idea of national exceptionality and dominance, not identity. What kind of identity can we talk about if everything that was cherished by the Ukrainian people was trampled during this political fight and mayhem? In order to govern the zombies, since it is much easier for Zelensky to do than to deal with what he promised to do everything for the benefit of the Ukrainian people and to preserve the genuine identity of its people. Basically, everything that I was telling you about, that's one way of putting it, but this is the genuine, the true colors of the Ukrainian democracy. Here we see the influence of Washington. The workers' rights, just like human rights in Ukraine, have turned to nothing, are just empty words in Ukraine. By way of celebrating May 1st, Zelensky was much closer to the West than he imagined, especially now. Well, that's just broad strokes, and let's move on to the crux of the matter. By doing so, Donetsk suffers enormously. It had the lion's share of suffering throughout the 9 years of the Kiev aggression against the Russian-speaking population of Donbas. We get daily reports regarding the atrocities against women, children, elderly. We see the loss of life by men as well, by those who defend Donbas. But that gives you an idea about the Kiev regime. They don't make any difference between women and men, and it's not because they value the human life. It's because they don't care a bit about the life. People are being killed in the heart of the city. The Ukrainian nationalists made a missile attack against the capital of the DPR using American HIMARS systems. A missile struck a minivan, killing 7 people, including children. Where's the Western response? Have you seen any Do you remember that their humanism was symbolized by the picture of a Syrian boy, photos and footage of children that suffered in Syria? They were circulated widely in Paris, London, Berlin. They were part of the election campaign, the rhetoric of politics in the EU political landscape. And now, after that, it turned out that this was just hypocrisy. But here, children died, and that is a fact. Has anybody heard any response? Maybe we just missed it, missed any debates in the British Parliament. Maybe the British Prime Minister came to his Parliament and made a briefing on the life of the children that were killed by the Kiev regime sponsored by the UK. Not at all. They just cynically stated that they have been supplying depleted uranium projectiles to the Kiev regime, as if it were some kind of humanitarian assistance. As for reporting, they never gave any report or accountability. 10 persons were also wounded in the Republican Injury Center. Maybe France briefed you about that, or some international associations bringing together investigative journalists or journalists per se. Not at all, not in the slightest. The Ukrainian armed forces are not shy to use violent ways of destroying civilians using mines. Donetsk recently saw the explosion of 4 kids. 2 of them were seriously wounded. Spain, Portugal, Italy. Has anyone known about that? All media outlets are simply banned from seeing that, hearing that, learning about that. Northern Europe, that loves so much to feel compassion to the victims of conflicts, to issue them residence permits, to give them prizes and awards. Are these kids not worthy of prizes? They do not care about prizes. They just want to survive, as was the case over the past 8 years. But that's a different story. That is of no interest to anyone. That doesn't fit the picture that is painted by mainstream media using Washington, by the Washington's instruction. And it is all happening amid constant sessions in Washington, New York, Geneva, at various international platforms. I'm talking about events on the freedom of media, journalists' rights, fight against fake news and impartiality in media outlets. What kind of impartiality and freedom of speech can we talk about if nobody talks about that except for us? Regrettably, if you think that we do not give these materials to sectoral institutions, to special envoys, to offices of high commissioners in international organizations, to the international organizations per se, that is also wrong, because we provide these materials on a daily basis to wake up the international community. And here I'm talking about the West primarily, because they are dreaming constantly, except for some kind of illusions that are built by mainstream media. There's nothing else. There's no word of truth. In Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, there are still alternative journalists who were not victims of Western pressure against this collective information space. You can still hear and see something there, let alone the post-Soviet space, although it provides not a homogeneous coverage, but still the voice of truth is still heard somewhere. If we talk about the CIS countries, we brief our partners virtually on a daily basis. The CIS, the CSTO, are the integration associations. all this data are emerging every day. We include it in reports. At some point in time, they should reach this dormant conscience that still exists. Terrorist activities and subversion continue to gain ground. On the 29th of April, there's been an attack of the Ukrainian drone against an oil storage tank in the Kazacha Bay in Sevastopol. It caused fire. Representative of the Ukrainian MOD, Yusuf, basically confirmed the participation of the Kiev regime in this crime, and he claimed that there will still be ongoing strikes, as if Crimea is not populated at all. It is not inhabited. It is just a test range to implement these ill whims of the Kiev regime. But it is inhabited. It has civilians. Children go to schools. People are working there. Back in the day, they ran away from the Kiev regime because they realized how it will all end up and who will gain the upper hand at the Bankova Street. But now the Kiev regime does not conceal that they wanted to raise to the ground everything that is not part of their picture, that is not part of their worldview. By the way, representative of the Chief Intelligence Office of the MOD, Yusuf, advised locals not to be near military facilities that ensure the interests of the Russian army. That's an interesting way of putting it. On the 1st of May, in the Gachino region of the Leningrad region, the power grid was damaged. The second explosive device was deactivated. The cargo freight train was also went off the rail. Luckily, there were no casualties among Belarus brigade of engine drivers. Let me also highlight that today, at the level of our agencies, some additional clarifications were provided on Sevastopol, and we will definitely provide you with the relevant links. This provided the new detailed materials, information, and data on the subversion activities by the armed forces of Ukraine regarding Sevastopol.
We draw attention to an attempt by the Kiev regime to pass the responsibility for the clumsy work of its air defense system, because one of the Ukrainian missiles hit a residential house and caused the death of 17 people. It is not the first time such a tragedy happens, but the Ukrainian authorities and the Kiev regime try to behave as if the Ukrainian authorities are a terrorist regime, and their activities are also terrorist. And at the Bankova, they lie to their compatriots, and they invent things. They also use these events for propaganda purposes. We can also cite the mentioned cynical attack of the Ukrainian forces. They caused it the God's punishment for human. It is regarding the fight not connected with the special military operation, but just destroying the canonical Orthodox Church for many years, taking measures against priests and against worshippers, also questioning morals and the commandments of Christ as well, of course. And nothing sacred remains for them. It has become obvious after the tragedy in Odessa, because those people who really have memory, who really have conscience, and who really have soul, they remember the victims of the trade union house in Odessa. Have you heard anything from the Kiev regime with regard to that? Maybe somewhere in the international organizations something has been said, something has been done. Maybe there were calls to fight those who are guilty of that tragedy, because every day there are technogenic tragedies in the world, unfortunately the cases of extremism, catastrophes of all kinds that take a lot of lives. But even among those tragedies, there are unique ones, not taking into account the number of victims, but the lack of humanity of those who have committed that, and who has either admitted that, consented to that, or admitted confirmed the actions of those who acted against moral values. Nothing, no analytical reviews exist for that. It is not a PR campaign named Butcher. Those were real events in the Union House in Odessa. And what has happened since that tragedy? What has been said here in international organizations and at symposiums and international seminars? The Russian side has repeated and has explained where that logic leads. And that is the result. Absolute impunity, absolute lack of moral values with regard to all the spheres of life, with the leadership of the Kiev regime, has created terrible things with that country that we observe now. Western countries do not conceal their participation in the preparation of the so-called counter-offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces. They have already shipped the munitions for more than 600 million euro, and they plan to for this value to reach 1 billion euro. The German Minister of Defense, Boris Pistorius, announced the shipments of 80 Leopard 1 tanks, and in the nearest time, the Germans will begin to train more than 100 Ukrainian servicemen to handle them, and it is obvious who will be the target of this equipment. It is not the issue of training, of experience exchange. It's about annihilation of people in the conflict zone. But who is thinking about that in Germany in such categories? Moreover, 31 American Abrams tanks are expected in Bavaria, and there will be a course for Ukrainian servicemen as well. More than 1,000 fighters of Ukrainian Special Forces services are being actively trained. And a counselor to the Ukrainian president, Mr. Pedalak, threatened measures to his compatriots in case they voluntarily receive the citizenship of the Russian Federation. And as a result, they will be the target of the Ukrainian. Mr. Pedalak threatened measures to his compatriots in case they voluntarily receive the citizenship of the Russian Federation. And As a result, they will be the target of the Ukrainian forces. Does it concern only passport? I have a question to this Mr. Podolak. Is it only the question of passport? And if at Bankovo they find some real estate or business in the Russian Federation, will there be any investigation? Why does this segregation take place? Why can a person for the passport, why should he be punished? Maybe he has nothing else in his life. But those who have multi-billion businesses and profits from real estate, but now they are the leaders of the Kiev regime, why there will be no measures taken against them? Only because they have a lot of money? No, if there is no humanity, so take those measures if you are not ready. I address now the Kiev regime. If you are not ready to go back to the traditional values, normal values, if this process is irreversible for you, be consistent and provide information where you have those hidden assets, as if no one knows about that, because you are taking measures against people who are surviving, who experienced the Western experiments on the territory of Ukraine. Now you are taking measures against them. I'm not speaking about high-scale politics. I'm talking about survival of many people. Maybe Mr. Podolak was unable to understand why the residents of Crimea, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions decided to become part of Russia with their historic motherlands, because they do not want to stay with those who do not value their right to live. And they want to receive the passport of the country, maybe where they were born, where they have relative ties. And the Kiev regime refusing them this possibility to receive the passport. And regarding those who have passports and residential permits of Great Britain, of Germany, possibilities to stay there for a long period, guarantees provided by those countries, Germany, Great Britain, the USA, Canada, Israel. And those people forbid to their citizens to have the possibility to choose. Why? Why is it happening? The events in Ukraine for the next time prove the timely manner of the Russian special military operation. As the Russian leaders have stated, the tasks and the aims will be reached. And those experiments by the Kiev regime, they have nothing new. It's not just Nazism, it's neo-Nazism. It's the reincarnation of the practices of the recent past. I would like to tell you about the book day in Germany. What is the book day for any normal person, any contemporary person who goes to libraries now, visits online libraries where it is based on the knowledge of history and the main element. What is the book day? It's admitting the role of our civilization, of passing our heritage and so on. There are events in libraries, in scientific centers, at universities, at schools, speeches and editions of some special books, special materials. Now it has passed to a new technological base, flash mobs, hashtags and so on. So what's the book day in Germany? because when we celebrate Victory Day, we often forget the Black Day in German history. Just 90 years ago, on the 9th of May 1933, at the Opernplatz Square, now it is Bebelplatz in Berlin, and some other German cities, a barbaric act of burning by the National Socialists, mostly young people and students, of books unfavorable to the Hitler regimes. It was a barbaric and Nazi act. It had been planned beforehand by the Ministry of Propaganda, initiated by Goebbels. I would like to remind you, he was a philologist, a German philologist. He had that education, and that act became the highest point of the campaign organized by the Nazis to fight the literature not in accordance with the German spirit. Does it remind you of anything? Is there a prohibition to import the books to Ukraine? And the books covered are also children literature and cooking books. Everything possible was prohibited. So 90 years ago, more than 25,000 books by foreign and German authors were destroyed in one day, including humanist philosophers' books. And during the Nazi reign, the destroyed books amounted to billions of copies. And it was national pride, the issue of national pride. It was applauded by millions. They thought that it is what should be done. And now the same things happen. The more absurd, the wilder what is down at the Bankovo by the Kiev regime, the more they become convinced of the righteousness of their actions, and the more terrible the picture of their barbaric acts becomes, the more unique they consider themselves, and convinced of their rightfulness, starting from lawful acts and moral things. So 90 years ago, the burning of books became followed the prophecy of Heinrich Heine, who wrote that the burning of humanistic books would be followed by the mass burnings of people. And that is what is happening in Ukraine. And the circumstances are even more terrible, because in many aspects the Nazi Germany committed what before for hundreds of years there were no attempts to do. And the Kiev regime is acting with the understanding that the Nuremberg process had happened. And fascism and Nazism were condemned. But still the Kiev regime is repeating that and the German people had to repent for their barbaric acts, including the fight against literature and books. And there is a monument that in Berlin that reminds us of that. These are empty bookshelves and that are closed above by glass. And if someone in Germany can tell now that the monument has no artistic value and proposes to demolish it, he will be accused in Germany, ostracized, and so on. And if the same thing is happening on the territory of Ukraine, where Germany ships tanks and the trained so-called experts who are actually militants with Ukrainian and other passports, that is what has been happening in Ukraine for decades. What is the reason of such colossal duplication of conscience in Western countries? Because beyond the black page of its history, they have erected the monuments, but they continue to bear a moral responsibility. They protect those monuments. And if someone just has an idea to split paint or to write something on that monument, to desecrate it, that person would be found and would be punished by prison term. And his name will be published in the whole country, in schools, universities and other public organizations. There will be lessons of inappropriate behavior, of the results of such destructive logics. But in other countries sponsored by Germany, in many senses of that world, and from the point of view of Germany, never noticed in bringing to responsibility such people, has never condemned people in the countries where the monuments to the heroes of the great of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, were destroyed. And such countries are just near Germany. I would like to remind you, there's Poland, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, and of course Ukraine. It is a flagrant example. A terrible lessons of history was not learned by everyone back then, because the neo-Nazis in today Ukraine are just repeating those actions.
Basically, Kiev wanted to excel Nazi Germany, at least when it comes to the scale and scope of this campaign. The Ukrainian authorities proudly state that several dozen millions of volumes are destroyed. The majority are written in Russian. First, they were proud about that, then they bore responsibility for that, then they were ostracized for several decades. But initially, they were proud of themselves. They believed that that is an exceptional mission. There's no system whatsoever. They just deliberately destroy everything in Russian, including Ukrainian classical authors, their translation into Russian. That's what they decided to do, but that all started more than a year ago. Have you forgotten actions, quotas for radio and TV broadcasting on the use of the Russian language? Only think about that. People who say some things about human rights, freedom of speech, rights of national minorities, they couldn't even imagine that in the heart of the so-called civilized life, civilized Europe, there are states, and there is a state that could impose quotas for the use of a language, not to have a positive discrimination, that is, to get an opportunity to ensure the minimum quota and to boost the use of the languages of national minorities. But Russians are not national minorities in Ukraine. That is absurd. Nevertheless, there is such a term. Nobody couldn't imagine that quotas would be imposed on the language that is spoken there for many centuries. We have seen it for the past several decades, for the past several years. Now they just burned several dozens of millions of volumes, as they put it. the well-known Russian classical authors are banned from Ukrainian school curriculum. Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Turgenev. Once again, it confirms the prophecy by Genrich Geiner, with the simple difference that no nationalists in Ukraine initially started burning people 9 years ago. It happened on the 2nd of May 2014 in the trade union house in Odessa. We have no doubt that there would be an end to this mayhem in Kiev, and those who took hostage Ukraine and trying to change the identity of Ukraine using Goebbels' methods to separate this identity from people who have a shared future and past. These plans are doomed to failure, and certainly today we will highlight the Nord Stream situation, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, the extremist acts, the acts of terrorism, subversion, the different names to that. There is an ongoing investigation. Nevertheless, the countries that face such attacks, and allegedly they spoke about their own infrastructure, they put it in these terms. We continue to closely monitor the developments around the investigation of Nord Stream explosions that happened in September 2022. The culprits are yet to be identified, including due to the fact that Germany, Denmark, Sweden that carry out national investigation have no political will to ensure their transparency. We have repeatedly stated that it is impossible to ensure transparency without bringing on board Russian agencies and Gazprom. Let me recall that Russia made several requests. The letter of Mishustin, dated October the 5th, 2022, and the notes of the Russian Foreign Ministry were left without any substantive response. And this is demonstrated by the response by the Foreign Ministry of Sweden that we received late April this year. We provided a note urging to provide information on the circumstances of the terrorist attack and to investigate comprehensively the subversions, engaging Russian experts. And this time the Swedish side gave a formal reply limiting itself to the reference to a former correspondence. That is just a vicious cycle. Instead of a dialogue, we see the theater of absurd that is repeating itself time and again. There's no meaningful dialogue, let alone engaging in investigation and studying of the situation with the states that declared this investigation. They are doing everything to make this investigation non-transparent. At the same time, there is some news. Media outlets in these countries, primarily I'm talking about Germany, Denmark, and Sweden, but also other media outlets from other NATO countries, they're actively supporting them, clearly following the instructions of military and security services. They spread groundless Russophobic innuendo, and there is something new to that. Namely, lately there's been information by the Information. This is a Danish newspaper that claims that 4 days prior to the incident, there was a Russian warship near the explosion area. Allegedly, it could carry equipment, including mini-submarine, to conduct special operations at the seabed. It claims that the Danish security special services, they were silent before that, but 6 months have passed. So allegedly, the Danish security services have some pictures of a Russian warship. Well, it is reasonable for any journalist to state, and for any rank-and-file citizen, for any reader, is to say, can we look at it? Can we have a look? This footage cannot be made public to by the armed forces of Denmark. And you know why? Well, that is not funny already. The Danish security services will not make these pictures public. That is the basis for this conspiracy theory, because they are sensitive. You know what? That is the follow-up to a famous cartoon. Clearly, such bogus stories do not seek to establish the truth. They just want to make the situation harder. They just have one goal in mind, to make it seem that the investigation is ongoing. That's one thing. And secondly, the competent authorities, although we have doubts regarding their competence, that these authorities are still working. A great deal of money has been invested in these projects. There are costs, long-term, short-term costs to everybody that were engaged in these projects, and third countries as well. And third, to create some alternative versions and to divert the attention of everyone. And that is the main goal behind this smear campaign. Let me dispel this speculation of NATO non-partners. The information is made public, and it is odd that the journalists, as well as the Danish military, do not know about this. But I can brief you. From the 19th to the 24th of September 2022, the Baltic Fleet had practical exercises at the training ranges of the Baltic Sea, as it was previously planned. The forces and equipment of the Baltic Fleet that were engaged in this planned exercise, could not be located in the area of a supposed terrorist attack at the major gas pipeline, Nord Stream 2, since the combat training grounds are too far away from this area. We should bear in mind that there are facts, there are data, and there is a gap in education, enormous gap in education. You do remember Foreign Minister of Germany stating that there are some countries that are located hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from each other. There are no such countries. Well, of course, there are some countries of this sort, but you need to make several rounds across Earth. That would make you several hundred thousands of kilometers. There's data, facts, logic, a lot of computer programs, special apps that could calculate it. And all this information is made public. It is widely accessible. At the same time, there's this gap. Maybe that is a difficult thing for Western partners to understand. There's this gap in education that allow Western media to give this information to their readership. For all this time, the Baltic Sea Fleet was carrying out its maritime training exercises. At the same time, when we talk about the area of the supposed explosion, it is located in the exceptional exclusive economic zone of Denmark, that by definition rules out any activities and actions of the Baltic Fleet in line with UNCLOS. And certainly, Western media publish new version, breaking news version regarding Russia's involvement in the explosion of Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline 6 months after this incident, which is clearly evidence of the smear campaign by the West to rule out genuine perpetrators. Those experts in Denmark, Sweden, other countries publishing these materials, and it would be more reasonable to ask this question to the authorities of this country. Over the past 6 months, is it the first time on May and April 2023. Is it the first time that you have heard about the planned exercises of the Russian Black Sea Fleet? And before that, was it the kind of information that was not accessible to you? And local journalists should have asked a question to the local authorities. Why do you get your salary since you have not noticed these obvious facts that were made public? That's not only a question to local authorities, but it is also a question to journalists who just copy-paste everything and do not ask basic questions. Let's move on. And it has to do with May 1st, by the way. Everybody has been following mass rallies in France against the pension reform promoted by the government. It prompted quite a contradictory response in the society. This is a kind of a domestic affair in France, but we'd like to highlight something. The decision of the government to use its constitutional right to adopt a law without a vote in the parliament only triggered protests. And in this electric atmosphere, the traditional manifestation of May the 1st resulted in mayhem, in arsons, vandalism and looting in key French cities, including Paris. For their part, police officers were quite violent. There were hundreds of detainees and injured, including law enforcers. You have all seen it. Frankly speaking, after everything I saw, I get a question. If people from various parts of the state behave in such a way with regard to their own citizens, and at the same time they are not in a state of civil war, we're talking about peaceful situation and peaceful manifestation on May 1st, can this state have a right to be a beacon of human rights or, say, humanitarian rights and freedoms? Can it lecture anybody else? Has it reached the relevant level of harmonization of political, public, civil processes in this country before lecturing everybody else? Without any intention to interfere into domestic affairs of France, let me highlight this specifically, that is not the tradition of Russian diplomacy. A question begs itself. Amid such dire social and political standoff and basic split in the French society, how justified are regular lectures by officials in Paris regarding various sovereign states? I'm not only talking about Russia, although publicly and in social networks and international organizations, Paris is trying to lecture us, to teach us something. Every state has its own path for development, its historical process, and every state has its crisis situations. It overcomes it judging by its national interests, traditions, and peculiarities. It should be respected, and for it to be respected, it needs to be understood. You need to start from the beginning. Shouldn't the French authorities be more focused on myriad multiple problems and not to turn to others, searching for violations of human rights and the so-called authoritarian trends and other flaws? You should better focus on yourself. And a couple of topics that have to do with humanitarian situation. Last week, the capital of the Lao People's Democratic Republic successfully had the Russian Film Festival. It was organized by Voskino, Ministry of Culture of Russia, the Russian Embassy. The event showed Russian films and cartoons with Lao subtitles. The opening ceremony was attended by leadership of the National Council of the Lao DPR, the Ministry of Information, Culture and Tourism, other Lao agencies and organizations. They highlighted in their remarks that a chance to study Russian cinemas allows the new generation of Lao citizens not only to get an idea of new areas of development of modern cinema industry, but also to get a glimpse of the spirit and nature of Russians that are no strangers to the graduates of Soviet universities that today are high-ranking officials in Laos. The event was broadly covered by mass media. the Lao audience was interested in Russian cinemas, and it was showcased by a full house during the cinema screening. The organization of this Russian Film Festival proved that our cinema and our culture is highly relevant and important, and it also showcased significant prospects for the development of bilateral cooperation. On the 25th of April, Dula in the Republic of Cameroon saw the opening of the Russian Education Center with the support of the Education Ministry of Russia. On the first day of the work of the center saw the opening of Russian language courses that had over 100 students registered. During the upcoming fortnight, there would be an in-person courses for the students. They are to pass a Russian language test, and for those who already started the Russian language, they will have a chance to pass a basic test. The course is very intensive. It uses cutting-edge ethnic-guided communication methods for foreigners outside the language environment. Teachers of the center also implement special program for Russian as a foreign language for those who study in the Russian International School Galactica. The program is aimed at elementary and junior high students. The project is implemented within the Education Ministry program with the support of to support Russian language abroad. It seeks to develop and preserve win-win humanitarian cooperation between Russia and African countries.
And recently in Moscow, from the 25th to 27th of April, the International Assembly of the International Military Sports Council took place in Moscow. It unites 140 countries and is among the largest sports organizations. Around 80 states were participants, 50 representatives came to Moscow, and around 30 were connected online from Brussels, where the headquarters of the organization is situated. It is a good example of how interaction free from some external influence should be carried out. The Council did not impose restrictions in accordance with the ROC recommendations against Russian and Belarusian athletes, and they can take part in competitions with their flag and their hymn. And it is an example that a positive sign that common sense and impartiality still remain in international sports, in the interests not of someone's interests, but in the interests of international sports. There is friendship, there is a motto of friendship through sports, and it remains an instrument of strengthening interpersonal connections, rapprochement, and unification of different peoples of the world. And there is hope that the remaining sports sphere will soon be purified of the interests imposed by some countries. And now the announcement from the 25th to the 27th of May in the city of Sibay, in the Trans-Urals, the Sabantui get-together on investment will take place. Relevant issues on the development of economy of the Republic of Bashkortostan and Russia will be discussed. The organizer is the government of the Republic of Bashkortostan. More than 1,000 participants take part in the forum, including representatives of Belarus, Uzbekistan, and other countries. The Trans-Urals Sabantui was attended by more than 1.5 thousand participants from 61 territorial entities of Russia and other countries, and more than 20 agreements amounting to 107 billion rubles were signed. The Forum of Business Sheriffs is also planned within the framework of this Sabantui. And The plenary session powerhouse regions of the growth economy is planned, and among the topics discussed will be Islamic bank investment, localization of Chinese enterprises, the development of partner relations, the development of tourism, cooperation of the republics of Bashkortostan and the Republic of Kazakhstan, the issues of logistics and redistribution of cargo flows, and many other issues. The partners are the Committee on the Financial Markets of the State Duma of the Russian Federation, the Trade and Industry Chamber of the Russian Federation, Infraweb joint stock company, Delovaya Russia joint stock companies, the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Interagency Analytical Center, and the RBC Multimedia Holding, among others. So we advise media representatives to take part in the coverage of this event. Now, the last but not the least, the holiday of our people that I'm sure will last for eternity, will last in our memory. In the run-up to the 78th anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War, the embassies, the consulates general and territorial entities of the ministry take active part in thematic ceremonial events. We continue our coverage in social media regarding the role our country played in liberating Europe from Nazism. In studying the history of that time, we go along that difficult way with our heroic ancestors. Among the participants are diplomats in many countries of the world. Despite unfavorable, so to say, and sometimes aggressive external factors, they hold memorial events, including the ceremony, the Gardens of Memory, and the event, the Windows of Victory. They also lay wreaths to monuments to Soviet soldiers. In the ministry itself, on the 5th of May, ceremonies will take place. Flowers will be laid to memorials in the hall of the ministry. Then the delegation of the ministry, headed by a deputy minister, will lay a wreath to the grave of the unknown soldier near the Kremlin wall. There will be a ceremonial meeting dedicated to that date in our ministry, with the administrations of the territorial entities. The staff members of the ministry will take part in other cities in Russia. The ceremony, the Garden of Memory, will cover many cities, and many trees will be planted. In St. Petersburg, trees were planted in the park near the Peskarova Memorial Cemetery. In Yekaterinburg, the book was presented, The Garden of Victory, The Philosophy of Courage and Persistence. On the 2nd of May, there will be a concert dedicated to the holiday. On the 9th of May, there will be the ceremony of laying the wreaths and flowers on the territory of the Shirokorechinsk Memorial Complex in Vladivostok. Flowers will be laid to the memorial to the military glory of the Pacific Fleet. There will be such ceremonies as the Georgian ribbon, the candle of memory, and the minute of silence. And representatives of friendly consulates were invited to take part in the ceremonies. They will also be covered in our media accounts, in our social networks and not our social networks. So we invite everyone who is interested to follow our accounts, the account of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the central headquarters, and the representations in the regions of our country. So I'm ready to answer your questions. Is международная жизнь with us? Yes. Hello, Mrs. Zakharova. Recently, a French journalist, Xavier Offay, in his article for Atlantico, wrote that in Eastern Europe, the level of crime due to illegal flow of arms from Ukraine, the level of crime increased, and this process, ignored by the army and the media, will be continuous and dangerous. And according to him, it is of little concern to the Washington strategists. How can you comment on his statements? So, thank you very much for citing the French authors, journalists, but frankly speaking, I would prefer you to cite us as well, because I would like to say that this topic where the weapons with ammunitions will go and where they will appear, we have dealt on this issue for more than a year in a practical aspect, in different aspects. But for a year, we are talking directly about what is happening and what will happen in short term. And what we have told, and we spoke about that daily. We will give a link in the context of this briefing to that material. Everything mentioned by us came true, but not everyone in the West wants to see that. It's obvious why Washington does not want to see that, because it's part of their strategy to destabilize the situation on the European continent. The officials and the representatives of the leading parties do not want to see that. They have the relevant information in the European Union countries. It's not clear, but I think that the answer is the same because part of them are puppies of the Washington of their strategies. And regarding all types of munitions, of weapons, and regarding heavy weapons, although it is paradoxical, it has already appeared on the European markets, on black markets of weapons. What are the black weapons markets? It's not some land of miracles. You understand that? Because maybe it can be called like that, but it's not some closed area where the situation can be controlled. The black market, talking about weapons, it's everywhere, taking into account the internet factor. It's a possibility to buy through blockchain technologies not controlled by any governments or special services through some information chains in the internet. I would like to repeat, any types of weapons supplied by Western countries to the Kiev regime. You understand, organized crime, drug trafficking, pillages, and shipments to other regions of the world. Something remains on the European Union territory, something goes further. They appear to have an illusion that something remains, something goes by transit, and this transit part will not concern them. And they lived in that illusion when they created the Arab Spring, when destroyed Libya, tried to occupy Syria. They were in that illusion, and then they had to wake up when tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of migrants came to them with their problems and woke them up. And back then, they had to go to reality from some illusionary world. And we were talking about that constantly, including the briefings on the 23rd of January in the 2023 and other briefings. We dealt on that situation. Now I would repeat what has been said, but I will repeat that. The uncontrolled pumping up of Ukraine with arms by the Western countries provokes increase in criminogenic situation not only in Europe but also in the world. It happened from February 2014 to December 2021, but then the speed increased and the scale increased. Before the special military operation, the Kiev authorities got around $70.5 billion in military aid. I would like to highlight it was before the special military operation. So in less than 10 years, for 6 years, more than $70 billion had already been allocated to the Kiev regime as military assistance. Although the control, as the experts say, was extremely weak, but there was actually no control. Because regarding the EU, the US, at some point there was lack of patience regarding the corruption schemes at the Bankovaya in Ukraine and the affiliated structure. They demanded investigations, materials were published, some people were fired, there were persecutions and so on. But that was not covering the substantial schemes, criminal schemes, because it's some united chain. From Ukraine, the lethal arms migrated to other unstable regions of the world. During the period of the Russian special military operations, the volume of military aid had become unprecedented. The number of American and other Western arms exceeded those shipped for the 10 years of the war in Afghanistan to the Mujahideens. And such irresponsible mass distribution leads to their passing to the arms of terrorists and to criminals. But will they go to the external regions of the world? They have different tasks and the trade goes on with the use of cryptocurrencies, and the consumers become terrorists and criminals. It would be a powerful catalyzer of sharing the criminal spheres of influence and mafia wars, where the new criminal groups will take place. But if someone has illusions that it will remain there, it is some closed by a fence, area closed by a fence. If you are someone who obeys the law, you cannot get there. It's an illusion. It's a mistake. I would say that it's a crime to consider that. And to communicate that information to your population. By getting the weapons, the criminals, the terrorists and the extremists use them not against each other, but against civilians, against the state as well. They're selling at the black markets. The selling of the supplied weapons is not of such concern to the West, to the collective West. The major beneficiary of the crisis is the American military industry that is trying to gain the commercial profit despite everything. It could be of unprecedented scales, particularly if they get the weapons, the munitions, and if it is the portable anti-aircraft missile systems like Stinger or anti-tank missile system Javelin, you could imagine the scale and the consequences. But the West, as you understand, it was Marx who wrote that there are profits after which moral values cease to exist. It's not about moral values here. Firstly, it's about common sense, and secondly, it's about common sense in the context of someone's own security and prosperity. But after some sums of money, some feelings just stop to exist. Is Ria Novosti with us? Yes. Hello, Ms. Zakharova. We have a question. Today, the Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu said that the meeting of the heads of foreign ministers of Turkey and Iran is planned for the 10th of May in Moscow. Can you confirm this information? Well, firstly, the working contracts of the parties in the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul are going on constantly. It is these are regular contacts adhering to the rules of procedure. And the summit meeting is discussed, but the terms have not yet been agreed. As soon as they are agreed, I promise, we will inform everyone of that. But only today, in the media, there were 2 dates cited in the media. Please be patient. It's not the issue of reprinting or frequently asking questions. It's not the case. As soon as the date and the format are agreed, we will confirm it as soon as possible. And our estimations of the Black Sea Initiative regarding the Russian agricultural products and fertilizers reaching the global market, our estimations are well known, and Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke about it in detail during his stay in New York and his meeting with the Secretary General in the press conference.
On May 1st, Moscow will host another round of consultations on the implementation of the MOU between Russia and the UN. It will be headed by UNCTAD Secretary General Rebecca Greenspan. Frankly speaking, as of now, this is an exhaustive answer. The thing is that I had a question not on the grain deal, but on the meeting between foreign ministers of Russia, Turkey, Syria, and Iran. I misheard you, I believe. Okay. What was the question? According to some media reports, Mevlut Çavuşoğlu announced today that a meeting of ministers of Russia, Syria, Iran, and Turkey is scheduled for May 10th in Moscow. Would like to know whether that's true. Okay, I would clarify that and I would respond to you quickly, maybe during the briefing. Let's move on. Next question. The Moscow Post. Are you here with us? Hello, we have 3 questions. First, there was an attack on Russian Center for Science and Culture on Cyprus, and there was a ban by Polish air company of a Russian tennis player. Last year, there was a report on violations of human rights of Russian compatriots abroad. What is the situation as of now, and what should be done to confront discrimination and threats? That's a pretty comprehensive question. Let me answer on a case-by-case basis. First, today we'll have a Cyprus ambassador in the foreign ministry who will be provided with the guarantees for security of Russian employees in Cyprus. With regard to the general situation that you have outlined, since the launch of the special military operation, it's been an unprecedented, unlawful, Russophobic campaign by the Western states. The situation is not improving. Unfortunately, it is even getting worse. There are victims among not only Russians, but also every Russian-speaking persons, especially I would like to highlight Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland. But he would like to make a reservation. This campaign was developed in the heart of the NATO bloc, but it is spreading due to various reasons via various channels, and it has spilled over other countries that are not unfriendly, and unfortunately to countries where we enjoy allied relations. But following this Russophobic campaign, we see situations regarding our missions abroad and our compatriots. We do understand that the authorities of these countries are investigating these cases, but currently we are talking about this sentiment that was nurtured by Washington, London, Brussels, and it is spreading in a destructive manner worldwide. Suffice it to recall an outrageous case of Polish actions regarding Russian school in Warsaw. It violates all the commitments under the diplomatic conventions. You have heard our response. You've heard that the Polish ambassador was summoned to the foreign ministry. As for the countermeasures taken by Russia, we will brief you certainly in due time. There was also firing and abuse of medical services, and there are insults, offenses, treatment, abuse of property. Information on all such cases is being carefully reported, and it is reflected in the relevant reports by our foreign ministry, including the annual report that you have mentioned. We are considering the relevant countermeasures. They are different when it comes to violation of human rights of Russians. The consulates and foreign embassies are dealing with that. The Russian foreign ministries have hotlines, they have phone lines, they are considering and studying various requests, and although we have limited resources in a number of unfriendly states, diplomats are considering such human rights tasks as their priority. In this regard, following such requests, we are working with local authorities, primarily at the level of foreign ministry, but also with law enforcers. We draw the attention to discrimination of international organizations, human rights organizations. We actively use the UN platform, the OSCE, as we draw the attention of the international community to the infringement of human rights among Russians. These illegal actions, these steps, these campaigns, this Russophobic campaign flagrantly violate commitments of these states under key documents when it comes to human rights and freedoms, including the Universal Human Rights Convention, international covenants regarding racial discrimination, and other international treaties and conventions. We urge Western countries to immediately stop bullying everything Russian, to return to bona fide implementation of their obligations in human rights, including when it comes to fighting discrimination. They should do that not to us, but also to their own people. They should abide by the commitments enshrined in their national law and international law. They have not banned it, thus they need to implement it. Political situation or political structures should not allow them not to implement their direct obligations and commitments. The head of our missions brief our compatriots on the relevant mechanisms for promoting their human rights. We also make requests to the United Nations platform and we use the special procedures of including the special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council on modern forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, zero tolerance when it comes to national minorities, and a lack of freedom of expression. Within the Human Rights Commissioner of Russia, together with our embassies abroad, we are updating constantly the database of legal experts and law firms that are ready to provide services to people abroad that found themselves in a difficult situation. Human rights activities are also conducted, among other things, by the Fund for Supporting Compatriots Abroad. There are law enforcement and human rights institutions in embassies in various countries. There are thousands of free of charge legal consultations. There are requests to human rights organizations. Also would like to highlight that there's the work aimed at fighting discrimination of Russians abroad. It is a comprehensive effort, and not only the foreign ministry is engaged in this effort, but also a number of other agencies and public institutions. You see that our investigative committee is working seamlessly in a well-calibrated way. So, well, at some point in time, we needed to have an official request, a transfer of information, materials, and so on. But currently, we are working with the investigative committee shoulder to shoulder on a broad range of the topics that I've mentioned, cases of violations with regard to Russians abroad, with regard to our missions abroad, and so on and so forth. As you know, the result depends not only on our work as the foreign ministry and as our missions, but also it depends on other things. You are well aware of the developments in the collective West, because we're talking about a well-planned political campaign that seeks to discredit everything Russian, dealing damage to everything that has to do with our country, people, and culture. We have to state that in Europe, local authorities have just responded to Russian requests in a formal way. And I'm not only talking about Europe, but also about the collective West as a whole. When Russians face discrimination, all too often, they receive a formal reply, maybe not a formal investigation, but some kind of an attention, a little attention to what is happening. But at times it is simply ignored. By the way, some of the compatriots have some discussions where they are told, indeed, there is a violation in a certain NATO country. You became a victim to criminal activities of culprits, but you do understand the political context of these developments. Wait a second. It is the very collective West that always said that law is law, there's nothing above it, that is the foundation of Western democracy, and the freedom of everything. At the same time, law should be respected. At the same time, they said that law should not interfere in the economy. I'm not talking about the international law, because it is clear to everyone how the West treats the international law. I'm talking about domestic law. If people come to them and they are told, I'm sorry, who are you? What nationality do you belong to? Ethnic group do you belong to? Where do you ethnically come from? And if a person gives a wrong answer in terms of the political situation, then there would be no criminal charges pressed with regard to this incident, and we are taken back to 80 years ago. Western Europe has already faced that when crimes were committed against persons and they were not investigated, they were encouraged because of national grounds. A family was sent to ghetto, business was taken away, they were taken away from the flat and they were insulted. Everything was encouraged and justified by Nazi Germany because these people were representing a wrong nationality. They pinned yellow stars to everything, clothes shops, everything. People were forced to live in ghetto, and it turned out that it was not the worst case scenario because after that there were gas cameras, gas chambers, and that is what we're revolting against. The world has already seen that. It is murderous, it is scary, and that is something that was enshrined as the atrocious crime during the Nuremberg tribunal for the humanity never to repeat it again. Let me emphasize that the work to defend human rights is something that we want to carry on doing. Thank you for this detailed answer. Recently, nuclear fuel was transferred to Akü nuclear power plant in Turkey. France supports the nuclear plant Paks 2 project that is implemented in Hungary. At the same time, Germany insists that the EU should include civil nuclear energy of Russia into the 11th sanctions package. What is the assessment of the Foreign Ministry with regard to two lines with regard to Russia and Europe? It has become clear long ago that the sanctions war unleashed by the EU turned out to be a failure. Russia does not suffer the expected damage counted upon by the collective West, and they backfire, basically. That is absurd, that is stupid, that is odd. More access to market to American sources. Clearly, by doing so, Brussels will damage itself if it introduces restrictions to the civil nuclear energy. At risk is not only the access to nuclear energy, but also the nuclear security of nuclear power plants in European countries. Thank you. And the last question. Russia has ratified a protocol on interaction of the CSTO member states and biological security. Previously, the Russian MOD briefed us on the biolabs of American military agency at the post-Soviet space. What neighboring countries have their biolabs controlled by the US, and what measures are to be taken in this regard? Ensuring biological security over the past years has become especially important in the international agenda, and you know why. Since when it comes to biological security, Washington turned them matters of biological insecurity or biological danger. The CSTO member states made a decision to prioritize this matter. On the 28th of April, President Putin signed law on ratification of the protocol. By the way, last year, the CSTO Committee of Secretaries established the Coordination Council that is in charge of all the biosecurity matters. The first session took place on the 15th of December last year in St. Petersburg, and the next meeting is scheduled for July in Minsk. Russia seeks to develop in-depth cooperation within the CSTO in this area, and we are ready to comprehensively bring about the efficient functioning of this entity. We prioritize biological security within the CSTO because there are numerous dangerous and uncontrolled biological activities by the US in various parts of the globe, including at the post-Soviet space. The US activities are of serious concern when it comes to implementing Convention on Biological and Toxic Weapons. The launch of the special military operation revealed new facts of how Pentagon and other agencies of the US in Ukraine, where they are not, which they are not neighboring, which is on the other side of the earth, and it became the test range for their experiments with very dangerous toxins.
And it was covered by the health minister of Ukraine, but actually those were Pentagon programs and the Ukrainian ministry itself. For some years worked not only under the auspices, but under the leadership of a person sent from North America with their citizenship, their passport, their work experience. By under the coverage of Center Epidemiological Assistance, they modernized and built biolaboratories in other countries, in among others in former Soviet Union states. And it was contrary to the protocol of the convention, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. And it is impossible to control the compliance of those sites in accordance with that convention. And we repeatedly stated the necessity to make this work transparent. And where they opened those laboratories, they said, of course, we can even organize the guided tour for you. But it's not regarding a guided tour. There is a difference between a tour and an inspection. It was only about visiting some reception area. But actually, yes, it was reception, where guests are registered and not allowed to go somewhere beyond. The investigations carried out by the US can be contrary to the international security, and one of the facts revealed is the acts contrary to the biological and toxin weapons conventions on the territory of Ukraine, and there's proof that the components of biological weapons were developed in Ukraine. It is published in our report on biolaboratories in Ukraine. And this information, at first it was surprising for them, and even the high-ranking American representatives did not deny such activities. And after that, after they realized the scale, the consequences, how to get out of this situation, and at first they did not find any words to justify them. They just admitted that they were carrying out such work. And many questions to Washington regarding those activities, as you know, remain without any reaction, any appropriate reaction, and all that requires solution. We will continue our work at the Profile International platform, mostly within the framework of the BTWC, regarding the claims we have and the situation in Ukraine reiterates the necessity to adhere to the BTWC, and the inspections should be carried out in the established framework with understandable results. It's not a guided tour. It's not what they want to show to you. It's not what you must see, what has been demonstrated to you. It's an inspection, it's control. And we intend to carry out the step-by-step work with the member states for the states to adhere to the convention, and we will seek further strengthening of the BTWC. We hold regular consultations and are in contact with the partners in the CSTO. Memorandums of understanding have been signed, and their implementation is an impetus to security of our countries and our friendly relations, and contributes to cooperation in this sphere. It's a necessary sphere for cooperation, for real practical cooperation. And I do not want journalists, experts, political scientists to see in this just a number of cliches of international lexicology. It's not about cliches. The year that brought to us the pandemics, COVID-19, has shown what life can be and the challenges the humanity can face. Just in 1 second, all the challenges. We thought that we know so much, and in a couple of weeks, the whole world is totally paralyzed because it does not know how to react and what it is dealing with. We now face those consequences. And the more concrete is the attitude of those in charge of those problems, the less it is just a terminology game, just rewriting some papers, some theory, the better it will be. And by the way, is it all with you? No more questions? I would like to come back to the RIA Novosti question regarding the meeting of Syria, Turkey, Iran, and of course Russia. The meeting is being prepared, but it is early to cite a date of when it will be conducted and where. If that is all, is a newsroom with us. Yes, hello, Ms. Zakharova. That's news.ru information portal. Regarding the reparations by Poland from Germany, they stated that they could require reparations from Russia, and the Polish authorities could start a dialogue on this issue with President Vladimir Putin. What is the attitude of Moscow to such plans? I would like just to say one word. Maybe it will be the end of the game. Thank you very much. Another question, has Vatican communicated a peace initiative to the Russian side? Has the Pope mentioned some initiative? No, as of today, the Russian side has not received any initiatives from Vatican, no proposals of the settlement of the Ukraine crisis. We do not have anything like that. We do not have any details of Pope Francis mentioned in the media, but the Holy See has repeatedly expressed readiness to provide mediation services. We all have seen that, we have read that. From the start of the special military operations, we maintained contact with the Holy See, and we're sure that the Vatican is well aware of our position. And regarding a peace process in Ukraine, maybe some people still remain who do not know that Zelensky forbade to himself to conduct peaceful negotiations with our country and to his regime. He has relevant legislation in place, and it is not surprising in connection with those criminals. And you know very well, the only thing that the Bankova is guided by are the orders of their Washington masters who are interested in hostilities, and they speak about that directly in Pentagon, in the State Department, the legislative authorities, and also some public figures, not all of them. but those who express some reasonable ideas are switched off of that discussion. You know what happens with journalists there? They're just fired, they're just not broadcast. And you know what the economists face, those who try to present some reasonable forecasts are threatened. They threaten to block their accounts. They get strikes. They get notifications, and it's refusal by the Kiev regime of any peaceful negotiations way. And the Vatican partners are well aware of that, and they should be aware of that, because I would like to highlight once more, there are still people who make conclusions about the situation in Ukraine, and they do not know that Zelensky forbade to himself and to his regime any negotiations with our country. Thank you. If that's all with you, thank you. Is Moscow Baku with us? Yes, hello, Ms. Zakharova. As we know, on the platform of the United States, with the mediatorship of the U.S. Secretary of State, it is the third day of the negotiations. It was has been announced that it will be several days. How can you comment on that? On the foreign ministers meeting and the American mediatorship. First of all, those negotiations take place without participation of Russia, and the process of what is happening there, it should be learned from the participants in those negotiations directly. And as soon as there are statements, as soon as every party makes a statement, some impression will be possible. And maybe we will have the right to comment, but it will be later. Secondly, we still adhere to the implementation of the tripartite statements adopted from 2020 to 2022. And regarding the third part of your question, the prospects of the meeting of the heads of foreign ministers of Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Russian territory, we have already announced that at the previous briefing. Yerevan has admitted the readiness to hold such meetings, and we will inform you regarding the terms later. So I have already answered your questions. Thank you. And another question. There is a conference, Moscow-Baku, dialogue of two countries. There will be different Russian performances, mutual exchanges. How important are such days of culture? First of all, those things are important in general in relations of any countries, because the relations of countries without the relations of peoples are impossible. Of course, you understand that there can be political contexts, there can be economical contexts, but without that humanitarian ties, interpersonal ties, cultural, educational exchanges, and so on, all that will have no true sense. And in the context of our relationship with any states, with any state, we of course consider today the policy of unfriendly countries with regard to our country. But let us leave this issue. We are ready to develop our relations with any countries, even with the unfriendly countries. We were developing that just before they went to the aggressive stage, just the desire to annihilate, to impose strategic defeat on us. But regarding educational projects, regarding humanitarian ties, there are still contacts. they are not developing at such a speed that is desirable, but there are also obstacles. However, they take place. That's the principal points of interstate relations. With regard to the relations between Russia and Azerbaijan, that also let us also take into account the proximity of our history, of our peoples, and it is interpersonal communication in families in such practical terms. And I do hope that that will continue, not from year to year, from decade to decade, but from century to century. And I think that our two countries are showing a good dynamics of such interaction in various directions. Thank you very much. That is all with me. Is Anna Lu with us? Yes. Hello, Ms. Zakharova. Today we have 3 questions. The first one, how do you assess the statements by the director of the French counterintelligence, Mr. Lerner, that Russia might try to infiltrate into the political circles of France? So I have a question in response. Did we interfere into the elections of the President of France? I just want a distinct answer, yes or no. The elections, the presidential elections took place. Did Russia interfere or not? Because it resembles something uncertain. And if we consider Sigmund Freud here, when something is born, maybe then dealing with something like that themselves, and they just transfer their thoughts, their way of thought, into someone else. Such statements are not new for us, because Russia is often mentioned in the political struggle in the West. And I think that the weaker the candidate is, the more problems he has, the more anti-Russian hysteria he expresses. The statements by Mr. Lerner, I think, are a vivid example of the concept of Russophobia that has conquered the thoughts of the Euro-Atlantic establishment. I would like to repeat that Russia, in contrast to France, has no habit of interfering into the affairs of other countries. We have commented on something that caused a lot of questions regarding the unrest in France, but we highlighted that it's the internal affairs of the state, the pension reform, the manifestation, the reaction by the police. It's the affair of France itself and its people. But we demonstrated that their rhetorics is in dissonance with what they present to their people internally. I would like to remind to the French counterintelligence and its director that it was not Russia behind the colored revolutions in a whole range of countries in the world, namely particularly in post-Soviet space. And it was not Russia who interfered in the affairs of the African states when they already gained their independence, their right to build their sovereign states. It was not our country interfering into, infiltrating into their political circles and bringing down unfavorable leaders. We consider this as another propaganda step to form the negative image of our country, of the whole people, culture and state.
We cannot rule out that the West tried to justify their failure in domestic policy, where they can write off all the failures to the influence of Moscow. That's what they like to do. The world sees a myriad of domestic problems in France. It has been happening for several years. This enormous domestic public standoff of the French citizens. It's not the French citizens versus citizens of other states, but the French citizens and those who have work permit, residence permit in this country. This Russian trait is a universal method to conceal all the ills, all the failures of the West. It helps them get rid of their rivals. We state that the West returns to the witch hunt of the medieval age. They try to revive these practices. Let me emphasize once again, everyone who allows himself to use this speculation when it comes to the freedom of speech, to freedom of expression, and once they face the same kind of rhetoric in their national policy, they see that those people who try to be impartial and rational, try to voice some sane ideas, share their vision of the situation, all of a sudden they're being ostracized. And sometimes the situation degrades towards repressions due to the political pressure. And those people who are not in line of standards by Washington, Brussels, and Paris, they are being abused, they are being considered as not worthy, not confident, not, in some cases, they're being punished, they're being fired. There are examples that abound, and let me give you just an example. The French journalist faced unparalleled pressure after her trip to the DPR in February 2022. She made a film on Donbass. She outlines an alternative viewpoint, and basically she was taken away from the media space of France. Sorbonne, the National Institute of Radio Broadcasting, and the so-called Independent High School of Journalism refused to continue cooperating with her. And that's it. That brings us back to the same issue. Although the freedom of journalism in the country that gave to the world the ideals of freedom, equality, and fraternity should remain inviolable. And I suggest that Mr. Lernel should once again watch the movie Professional of Jean-Yves Belmondo. It was allegedly Paris does not abandon this movie and the ideals of this movie. Thanks a lot. And the second question, President Putin, during his latest video address, during the ceremony of the opening of Aku nuclear power plant, he claimed that Russia is ready to step up cooperation with Turkey in supply of natural gas in third countries. Have there been recent efforts between the foreign ministries of Russia and Turkey to establish the gas hub? This issue of establishing a gas hub in Turkey in order to ensure seamless, credible supplies of natural gas to European consumers is something that is on our agenda. As for negotiations, practical negotiations in this regard, they are being carried out at the level of sectoral agencies and companies that are engaged in this infrastructure project. They represent parties of interest. And I believe that these agencies and these companies should give detailed comments to this regard. Thank you. And the third question, could you please comment on the documentary at the central television of 4 Scandinavian countries that allegedly Russia has a spy network in 3 capitals, in Copenhagen, Oslo, and Stockholm. We transferred this network to Mars, and we commented on this documentary in detail on the 21st of April on our website. The Media Corporation of China, CGTV. We have 2 questions. Last week, there had been a telephone call between President Xi and President Zelensky. China allegedly said that it would send to Ukraine its emissary, its envoy, to have an exchange of views on the political settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. What's your take on the Chinese role in settling Ukrainian crisis? We already provided a comment on this matter. I would like to just outline this comment in broad strokes. Our position has not changed. We note the readiness of the Chinese side to take effort to ensure a negotiating process. We see the similarity between the approaches of China and the relevant position document. At the same time, we believe that the problem is not that there are no good plans, although we welcome good plans. But let me reiterate something that we mentioned today and repeatedly on numerous occasions. The Kiev regime shows zero tolerance to any sane initiatives, and the possible agreement for negotiations is something that they link with some unrealistic demands. And that is the crux of the matter. Let me reiterate once again. The Zelensky regime and he personally banned themselves to have negotiations with Russia. The Ukrainian authorities and their Western mentors already showed their opportunities to delay peace initiatives. It was back before 2022. And it was recognized not only by them, but by those who guaranteed the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Namely, I'm talking about the guarantors of the Minsk agreements, the revelations by Merkel or Hollande. It was done not by chance. We're not talking about discussions behind the closed doors that were leaked. These are not pranks. These were interviews, the statements made to journalists on the record, where they said that the Minsk agreements basically were not working because the other side was not willing to implement them, and they wanted to use it for different goals. And this shows you once again that not just good intentions, but specific plan building upon the real analysis, the situation on the ground, the peculiarities of the conflict and the peculiarities of the situation. And this plan was abused by those who had to implement it. They had to do that not because they signed some arrangements that they believed were no longer important, but because it was part of the United Nations Security Council resolution that is legally binding to everyone. You do remember that the Minsk agreements, according to Western mentors of the Kiev regime, became a tool of buying some time for accumulating offensive potential, and in spring 2022, there were virtually ready-made developed peace arrangements, and they had the same fate as the peace Minsk agreements. These arrangements were refuted. You do remember that we sent the relevant materials following the feedback by Kiev, and we didn't receive any response. Zelensky also refused to have any talks with Russia on legal basis, at the legal level. That is why we see calls for peaceful talks, but they cannot be perceived by a puppet that is managed from the West. I have repeatedly seen the contradiction and logical mistakes, or even stupid things made by American mentors of the Kiev regime. With regard to zero tolerance to the communist ideology, I do remember the US representative was sitting at the round table of the Security Council during an open debate publicly. She said that we need to fight against communism worldwide. At the same time, in front of her was the Chinese representative as one of the P5 member states, and that is governed by the Communist Party of China. Not only the Communist Party of China is governing China, but it is also the biggest political movement, political party in the world. And the American representative tried to say something of this sort to the Chinese representative. She didn't even realize who she was talking to. The same goes for Zelensky. Deliberately or not, they followed the lead of their big brother. He is governing a country that officially banned the communist ideology and the Communist Party. Moreover, it is engaged in some kind of a decommunization process in Ukraine. Not so long ago, head of the International Affairs Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament, Miveshko, declared that Taiwan's recognition of China and Taiwan's ownership by China is something that is a communist misleading information. Thank you. And I have the second question. President Biden and the leader of South Korea, following their summit on the 26th of April, adopted a Washington declaration that establishes a consultative group on nuclear planning and developing specific plans to use these weapons. Following negotiations, the American leader also warned North Korea to have a regime change if Pyongyang tries to strike a nuclear missile against the United States. What's your take on that? We took note on the report regarding the arrangement between the US and South Korea on joint nuclear planning. Certainly, this event is destabilizing. It would have serious negative repercussions for regional security. It would have an impact on global stability as well. The US and its allies in the Asia-Pacific showed their desire to move towards destructive models in the international security, the so-called enhanced nuclear deterrence that Washington over a decade has been practicing within NATO, with full support of other North Atlantic member states that declared that it is a nuclear alliance. We're confident that further spread of such practices by the collective West would not lead to anything but fueling tensions. It would trigger crisis in terms of security, and we urge the United States and its allies that implement a number of military programs that undermine global strategic stability. We urge them to stop destabilizing the situation and abandon steps that weaken the overall level of security for all states. Do you have any other questions? Then ura.ru. Hello, Madam Zakharova. The first question has to do with the situation around the Russian school in Poland. It was seized. What specific countermeasures will be taken in this regard? If you want me to tell you what specifically would be done, 1, 2, 3, you do understand that these measures are taken and then made public once we have a detailed consideration between our agencies. This work has already started, I can assure you, But until it is completed, we cannot give you any specific measures. I believe that that is not possible. At the same time, we have already repeatedly stated that everything that we see from officials in Warsaw, not only seizure of Russian school, but also this assertive, aggressive policy, it would receive a response, a severe response. We live up to our promises, and we have shown it time and again. That's all that I can say as of now. And these are just not the words that were said during a debate. It was already made public after the Polish ambassador to Russia was summoned in the foreign ministry. We provided the relevant information to him. Okay, clear. And a question on evacuation from Sudan, but I believe that you have covered it extensively. A follow-up question. You talked about May 9th. In many countries, the organizers of the Immortal Regiment face certain problems, difficulties to organize this march. We talked with some of them. For instance, in Germany, people even refused to give us any comment. In Kazakhstan, a friendly state does not give any permission to this march. First, they were making references to COVID restrictions, but there is no longer any pandemic, yet no permission. Do you have any feedback, any response? In my introductory remarks, I told you about that we're not only following these events, but we're participating in this event as the foreign mission, since we're talking not only about the event that is for us a systemic one. I'm talking about the Victory Day, the day of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. That is a world scale, a day that is enshrined by the General Assembly and the Nuremberg trials. So as a party, a victorious party, and a participant to the anti-Hitler coalition, we're entitled to celebrate this day and to support all the compatriots that see this idea of anti-fascism not as a part of a PR campaign or part of implementing some bogus stories, but it is the part of the raison d'être. How will we do that? You can study it in my introductory remarks. As for the challenges, it all started more than a year ago, long before that, and these challenges, as you put it, they have to do with not only confrontation from Washington, using NATO entities. It introduces some impediments, some counter arguments, and does all the nasty tricks. But it is also something that has a global dimension: vandalism, desecration of monuments, the lack of opportunity to visit these monuments. In some cases, we're talking about a political situation that does not allow us to visit monuments. In other cases, we're talking about some objective difficulties, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic. But meticulously, on a daily basis, our embassies have been working on that. In some cases, some specific offices of the embassy is working. In some cases, we're talking about individual work of an individual. In other cases, this is the joint effort of our embassy and Россотрудничество. In certain cases, we're talking about the work of the embassy and local associations of compatriots and local public movements that bring together citizens of these countries. I'm talking about foreigners. Everywhere we find our ways to preserve this memory. And the countries that you have mentioned, we also work meticulously with local authorities there. In some cases, that is possible. In other cases, the authorities of these countries refuse to talk about anything including this matter. So we understand the scope of our tasks. As for the implementation, we use various means at our disposal. I will definitely tell you about specific measures by our foreign missions abroad, where our foreign ministers foreign missions supported public activists. So follow our social networks accounts. But I will provide you with this detailed overview once we celebrate Victory Day.
Is Treska Trinatsit with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. We have two questions. The first one, the Foreign Ministry of Finland has informed that Helsinki is preparing an agreement with the United States to host American military bases in Finland. Can you comment on that statement? I have already said that Finland is losing its sovereignty step by step, and that's the beginning of the process. It's a full-fledged process, and there are many countries in the alliance, and this is one more. And the information was published last year about the foreign ministry, and the United States preparing that agreement, including possible deployment of American military contingents in Finland. So it's not new to us, and we are aware that Finland is about to explore the Finnish territory for American purposes, and there is a growth of tension in this region. It's one of the factors, and within the framework of NATO and NATO itself, in bilateral agreements with the European states, there is a direct confirmation of the aim of Washington to impose strategic defeat on us. It is a confirmation, and the Russian Federation is to take steps in return. The control steps, as the Russian leadership has said, will consist of measures in reply to the deployment of NATO strike weapons and military systems. Another question, the finance minister of Russia, Anton Siluanov, declared that the BRICS countries might work out a unified currency. Is such currency possible in the near time? Taking into account the current political situation of the Western currencies, euro, dollar, being used by NATO-centric countries and their military political alliances as an instrument of pressure and somewhere as an instrument, as a direct weapon. More countries are thinking about alternative systems in their accounts, and BRICS acts in accordance with those tendencies. It's just life dictating those actions. It's just refusal to accept the pressure and the understanding and negative attitudes towards another deception by the West. Because for many years it has been said that dollar is not the US supranational currency, but it's just some element of the internal economic space that the US is ready to provide to everyone for international financial cooperation, for accounts of international subjects. It was presented like that. Despite that, there were talks about inacceptability of political pressure and the impossibility of the use of political situation that would somehow put obstacles to the natural way of market relations. That was not the initial plan. And the initial plan by Washington was to use it in critical moments as an element of blackmail, of pressure, as sometimes even of a weapon, an instrument to implement some dirty, unlawful tasks and aims. The currency that could be used among the BRICS countries, that idea was proposed at the BRICS summit on the 23rd of June 2022. This initiative requires a detailed expert analysis, and this creation of supranational currencies is not an easy process, and it is in the focus of constant attention by the countries, by the BRICS countries, and this issue might be touched upon during the meeting of the leaders of the 5 countries in South Africa. Any other questions? Maybe I have not answered someone's questions. If you have no other questions, let me say goodbye to you. As always, I wish you prosperity. See you later. And the most important thing, I wish you a happy holiday, happy Victory Day, and as it is a vital and living memory for us, and we will congratulate each other. Thank you very much.